General Marcus Volkov stepped out of the black diplomatic car onto the cobblestones of Whitehall, his military uniform crisp with golden braids that caught the morning sunlight. The crisp London air filled his lungs as he surveyed the historic buildings around him. This was his first official visit to Britain as the newly appointed general of the Eastern European Defense Alliance, and he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. At 52 years old, Volkov had climbed the military ranks through a combination of political cunning and genuine tactical skill. His thick accent carried the authority of someone accustomed to being the highest-ranking person in any room. Back home, soldiers jumped at his slightest gesture, and government officials sought his approval for major decisions. The general's reputation preceded him wherever he went. His aide, Captain Dmitry Petrov, walked beside him carrying a leather briefcase containing sensitive diplomatic documents. The meeting with British defense officials had been scheduled for months, part of a crucial NATO alliance discussion that could reshape European security. Volkov had spent weeks preparing, studying British military history and protocol, yet somehow he had overlooked one fundamental aspect of British tradition. As they approached the entrance to the Ministry of Defense building, Volkov noticed the iconic red-coated figures standing motionless at their posts. The Queen's Guards, with their tall bearskin hats and stoic expressions, had become symbols of British tradition known worldwide. To most visitors, they represented living history, soldiers worthy of respect and admiration. But to General Volkov, they appeared to be nothing more than costumed performers, tourist attractions dressed up for show. His military mind, trained to recognize practical combat readiness, dismissed them as ceremonial decorations. In his homeland, soldiers wore modern combat gear and projected strength through movement and action, not through standing perfectly still. The general's first mistake was his assumption that these guards were merely for display, actors playing roles rather than active military personnel. He had no understanding that behind those stoic faces stood highly trained soldiers from elite regiments, men who had served in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other conflict zones around the world. Volkov's second error was believing that his rank and diplomatic status placed him above British military traditions. He had grown accustomed to special treatment wherever he traveled, with local officials bending rules and customs to accommodate his preferences. The idea that he might need to show respect to what he perceived as lower-ranking ceremonial guards never crossed his mind. As they walked past the first guard post, Volkov barely glanced at the soldier standing at attention. The guardsman's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, his expression unchanged, but years of training had taught him to notice everything happening around him. The approaching foreign general's dismissive body language and arrogant stride did not go unnoticed. Captain Petrov, who had studied British customs more carefully than his superior, felt a growing sense of unease. He had read about the strict protocols surrounding the Queen's Guards and the respect they commanded from all visitors, regardless of rank. The captain knew that these were not actors or tourist attractions, but genuine soldiers deserving of military courtesy. The morning sun climbed higher as more tourists and officials moved through the area. Several stopped to take photographs with the guards, maintaining a respectful distance and speaking in hushed tones. Children pointed in wonder at the tall hats and red coats, while their parents explained the historical significance of these living symbols of British military tradition. Volkov observed these interactions with growing irritation. He saw civilians treating costumed performers with more deference than they would show to a real military officer like himself. The general's pride, already inflated by years of unchallenged authority, began to simmer with resentment. The diplomatic schedule called for several stops throughout London before the main meeting. As they moved from building to building, encountering more guard posts along the way, Volkov's attitude hardened. Each silent, unmoving figure seemed to mock his own importance, standing there like statues while he, a real military leader, walked past unacknowledged. The general's worldview had been shaped by decades of commanding respect through rank and intimidation. In his experience, military bearing meant aggressive posture, loud voices, and immediate recognition of superior authority. The quiet dignity and understated confidence of the British Guards challenged everything he understood about military presentation. By midday, as they approached their most important meeting, General Volkov had made a decision that would change the course of his visit and potentially his career. He would demonstrate to these British soldiers what real military authority looked like, teaching them proper respect for their betters. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose the dangerous gap between the general's inflated self-image and the reality of British military tradition. His lack of understanding about the true nature and authority of the Queen's Guards would soon lead to consequences he could never have anticipated. As the diplomatic car pulled away from their latest stop, heading toward the most prestigious guard post in all of London, General Volkov straightened his uniform and prepared to assert his authority. He had no idea that he was about to challenge an institution that had stood firm against far greater threats than one arrogant foreign officer. The black diplomatic vehicle rolled to a stop outside Buckingham Palace, where the most famous Queen's Guards in the world stood at their posts. General Volkov stepped out onto the pavement, his eyes immediately drawn to the two motionless figures flanking the palace gates. These guards represented the pinnacle of British ceremonial tradition, chosen from the elite regiments and trained to maintain their posts under any circumstances. Guardsman James Morrison had been standing at his post for 40 minutes, his eyes fixed on the horizon as he had been trained. Behind his stoic expression lay the mind of a decorated soldier who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and earned commendations for bravery under fire. His red tunic bore subtle indicators of his rank and service that only those familiar with military insignia would recognize. The crowd of tourists around the palace gates maintained their usual respectful distance, taking photographs and speaking in whispered tones. Parents pointed out the guards to their children, explaining the history and importance of their role. Tour guides shared stories of the guards' training and dedication, emphasizing that these were real soldiers performing an important duty. General Volkov surveyed the scene with growing frustration. He watched as hundreds of civilians showed deference to what he still believed were mere ceremonial figures. The general's military mind rebelled against the concept of soldiers standing motionless while he, a genuine military leader with decades of command experience, walked past unacknowledged. Captain Petrov noticed his superior's darkening mood and attempted a quiet intervention. "General, perhaps we should review the protocol briefing before we proceed to the meeting," he suggested diplomatically, hoping to redirect his commander's attention away from the guards. But Volkov waved his aide's concerns aside with an impatient gesture. "These British games waste time that real soldiers could spend on meaningful duties," he muttered in his thick accent, his voice carrying further than he intended. Several tourists turned to look at the foreign officer, sensing the tension in his tone. The guards, trained to notice everything while appearing to notice nothing, remained motionless but alert. Years of experience had taught them to identify potential disturbances before they escalated. The general's next decision would prove to be his first major tactical error. Instead of proceeding directly to his diplomatic meeting, he chose to approach the guard post. His intention was to demonstrate what he perceived as proper military bearing, to show these British soldiers how a real officer commanded respect. Volkov strode directly toward Guardsman Morrison, stopping just inches from the soldier's post. The general's imposing figure, adorned with medals and golden braids, cast a shadow over the motionless guard. The crowd of tourists sensed something unusual happening and began to gather at a respectful distance, some raising cameras to capture the encounter. "Soldier," Volkov announced loudly, his accent thick with authority. "I am General Marcus Volkov of the Eastern European Defense Alliance. You will acknowledge my presence and show proper military courtesy." Guardsman Morrison's training kicked in automatically. The Queen's guards were instructed to remain motionless and silent unless directly threatened or ordered to move by their commanding officers. No foreign officer, regardless of rank, had the authority to command them or expect acknowledgement while they were on ceremonial duty. The guards' continued silence and stillness only fueled Volkov's growing anger. In his homeland, such perceived insubordination would result in immediate disciplinary action. The general interpreted the guard's proper execution of his duties as a personal insult to his rank and authority. "This soldier shows disrespect to a superior officer," Volkov declared to his aide, speaking loudly enough for the growing crowd to hear. "In any proper military, such behavior would not be tolerated." Captain Petrov felt his stomach tighten with embarrassment and concern. He recognized that his general was making a serious mistake, but felt powerless to intervene without publicly contradicting his superior officer. The captain's knowledge of British customs made him acutely aware of how inappropriate his general's behavior had become. Tourist cameras began clicking more rapidly as visitors realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. The scene unfolded like a clash between two completely different military cultures, with the immovable British tradition facing the aggressive foreign authority. Volkov's military career had been built on the principle that rank commanded instant recognition and obedience. Every soldier he had ever encountered had jumped to attention at his approach, saluted sharply, and responded to his commands without hesitation. The guard's unwavering silence challenged the very foundation of his understanding of military hierarchy. The general took another step closer, now standing directly in the guard's line of sight. "I am speaking to you, soldier," he demanded, his voice rising with indignation. "Your silence shows disrespect, not only to me, but to the military alliance your country has asked to join." Guardsman Morrison's training had prepared him for many unusual situations, but handling an aggressive foreign general while maintaining ceremonial protocol presented a unique challenge. His orders were clear: remain motionless unless directly threatened. The approaching officer had not physically threatened him, despite the increasingly hostile tone. Other guards at nearby posts became aware of the developing situation through their peripheral vision and enhanced alertness. Palace security officers, both uniformed and plain-clothed, began positioning themselves closer to the scene while maintaining their professional appearance. The crowd of tourists grew larger as word spread that something unusual was happening at the palace gates. Some visitors began recording videos on their phones, capturing what would soon become an international incident. Social media posts started appearing within minutes, tagged with location markers and dramatic descriptions. General Volkov's frustration reached a boiling point as the guard maintained his position. In the general's mind, this silent soldier represented everything wrong with ceremonial military traditions. He saw weakness disguised as discipline, pageantry masquerading as genuine military bearing. The general's final mistake of this phase was his decision to escalate the confrontation. Rather than walking away or proceeding to his important diplomatic meeting, he chose to press his perceived advantage. Volkov believed that his rank and diplomatic status gave him the authority to demand compliance from any soldier he encountered. As the morning sun climbed higher over Buckingham Palace, casting longer shadows across the courtyard, the stage was set for an escalation that would test both men's training and resolve. The immovable force of British tradition was about to meet the irresistible arrogance of foreign authority. With hundreds of witnesses and cameras recording every moment of the confrontation that would soon spiral beyond anyone's control. General Volkov's patience finally snapped as Guardsman Morrison continued his silent vigil. The general's face reddened with anger and embarrassment as he realized the growing crowd of tourists was watching his authority being ignored by a motionless soldier. His military pride, built over decades of unquestioned command, could not tolerate what he perceived as deliberate insubordination. "This is intolerable," Volkov announced loudly, gesturing dramatically at the unmoving guard. In any real military, a soldier who refuses to acknowledge a superior officer would face immediate court-martial. The crowd's murmur grew louder as visitors exchanged glances and whispered comments about the foreign general's behavior. Many tourists recognized that something was seriously wrong with this confrontation, though few understood the cultural and military protocols being violated. Captain Petrov made another desperate attempt to defuse the situation. "General, perhaps we should proceed to our scheduled meeting. The Defense Ministry officials are expecting us, and this matter could be addressed through proper diplomatic channels." But Volkov was beyond listening to reasonable counsel. His ego had been challenged in public, and his military instincts demanded a decisive response. The general's next action would cross a line from which there could be no easy return. Volkov reached out and poked the guard's shoulder with his index finger, a gesture that was both physically invasive and completely inappropriate according to British military protocol. "I am ordering you to acknowledge my presence, soldier," he declared with authority that carried no weight in this situation. The moment the foreign general's finger touched Guardsman Morrison's uniform, everything changed. The guard had been trained to tolerate verbal harassment, public ridicule, and even minor physical contact from unruly tourists, but deliberate aggressive contact from someone who should know better crossed into unacceptable territory. Morrison's training allowed for measured responses to physical interference. Without breaking his ceremonial stance or changing his facial expression, the guardsman spoke in a clear, commanding voice that cut through the crowd's chatter. "Stand back from the Queen's Guard." The simple statement carried the weight of centuries of British military tradition and the authority of the Crown itself. Every word was delivered with precision and unmistakable command authority that silenced the surrounding tourists and struck General Volkov like a physical blow. For the first time since approaching the guard post, Volkov realized he might have misjudged the situation. The guard's voice carried the unmistakable tone of a professional soldier, not the weak protest of a ceremonial performer, but the general's pride prevented him from backing down in front of the watching crowd. "You dare to give orders to a general officer?" Volkov demanded, his voice rising to near-shouting levels. "I have commanded armies while you play dress-up for tourists." Palace security officers began moving closer to the developing confrontation, their training alerting them that the situation was escalating beyond normal tourist incidents. The lead security officer, Inspector Sarah Davies, spoke quietly into her radio to alert backup units and superior officers about the diplomatic incident unfolding at the palace gates. Guardsman Morrison repeated his warning, this time with slightly more emphasis. "Step away from the Queen's Guard. This is your final warning." The crowd of tourists had grown to nearly 100 people, all watching the confrontation with fascination and growing concern. Phone cameras recorded every moment, and live social media streams began broadcasting the incident to viewers around the world. Within minutes, hashtags related to the confrontation started trending on multiple platforms. General Volkov's military career had taught him to project strength through aggression, but he was discovering that British military culture operated by different rules. The guard's calm authority in the face of his anger was more intimidating than any shouting match he had ever experienced. Captain Petrov, recognizing that his general was about to create an international incident, made a bold decision to intervene directly. "General Volkov," he said firmly, using his commander's full name and title to emphasize the seriousness of the moment. "We have a crucial diplomatic meeting in 15 minutes. Our entire alliance depends on maintaining good relations with British officials." The reminder of the high-stakes diplomatic meeting finally penetrated Volkov's anger-clouded judgment. He began to realize that his confrontation with a ceremonial guard was being witnessed and recorded by hundreds of people, including what appeared to be several British officials and security personnel. But his retreat was interrupted by the arrival of the guard commander, Lieutenant Colonel William Ashworth, whose approach had been signaled by palace communication systems. The commander's presence transformed the situation from a tourist incident into a formal military confrontation between allied nations. Lieutenant Colonel Ashworth approached with the measured pace of an officer who had dealt with diplomatic incidents before. His uniform bore the insignia of multiple combat deployments and prestigious military decorations. This was clearly not a ceremonial figurehead, but an active combat veteran with real authority. "General Volkov?" The commander addressed him by name, indicating that palace security had already identified the foreign officer. "I am Lieutenant Colonel Ashworth, commander of the Queen's Guard." "I understand there has been some misunderstanding about our protocols." The formal military bearing and obvious combat experience of the British officer forced General Volkov to reassess his entire approach to the situation. He was no longer dealing with what he perceived as costumed performers, but with genuine military professionals who commanded real respect and authority. Inspector Davies positioned herself within immediate response distance while maintaining a respectful appearance. Her years of experience with diplomatic security had taught her to prepare for rapid escalation while hoping for peaceful resolution. The crowd sensed that the confrontation had reached a critical moment. Tourist chatter died away as everyone focused on the three military officers facing each other at one of the world's most famous landmarks. The scene had all the tension of an international diplomatic crisis, compressed into a few square meters of historic pavement. General Volkov found himself trapped between his wounded pride and the growing realization that he had seriously misunderstood both the situation and the people he was confronting. The approaching diplomatic meeting, his military reputation, and potentially his entire career hung in the balance of his next decision. Lieutenant Colonel Ashworth's presence brought a sudden gravity to the confrontation that General Volkov could not ignore. The British commander's calm professionalism and obvious combat experience created an atmosphere of military respect that transcended nationality and protocol. For the first time since arriving in London, Volkov found himself facing a peer who commanded genuine authority. "General," Lieutenant Colonel Ashworth continued in measured tones, "Guardsman Morrison is executing his duties according to protocols established by Her Majesty's military regulations. These procedures are not subject to modification by visiting officers, regardless of rank or diplomatic status." The words hit Volkov like a tactical briefing that exposed every flaw in his approach. He began to understand that his assumption about ceremonial soldiers had been completely wrong. These were not actors or tourist attractions, but active military personnel following legitimate orders from their chain of command. Captain Petrov felt a mixture of relief and horror as he watched his general's realization dawn. The captain's diplomatic training helped him recognize that this moment could either defuse the situation or escalate it into a career-ending international incident. The crowd of tourists remained silent, sensing they were witnessing something significant. Phone cameras continued recording, and social media posts about the confrontation were already spreading across international news networks. The hashtag Buckingham Palace incident was trending in multiple countries within 20 minutes of the initial confrontation. General Volkov's military mind began processing the tactical situation with growing alarm. He was surrounded by British security personnel, being filmed by hundreds of civilians, and confronting professional soldiers on their home territory. Every principle of military strategy suggested immediate retreat and damage control. "I was not properly briefed about British ceremonial protocols," Volkov admitted grudgingly, his accent thick with embarrassment. "In my country, All soldiers acknowledge superior officers regardless of their current duties. Lieutenant Colonel Ashworth nodded with understanding while maintaining his authoritative stance. Cultural differences in military tradition are common among allied nations, General. However, physical contact with a guard on duty constitutes interference with official military operations. The formal language made clear that this was no longer a simple misunderstanding, but a documented incident that would require official reports and potentially diplomatic intervention. Volkov realized that his impulsive behavior had created exactly the kind of international complication he had been sent to prevent. Inspector Davies stepped forward with practiced diplomatic timing. "Gentlemen, I believe this situation can be resolved without formal incident reports if all parties are willing to acknowledge the misunderstanding and move forward professionally." Her intervention offered General Volkov a face-saving exit from what had become an untenable position. The security officer's experience with diplomatic incidents had taught her that pride often prevented reasonable resolution of conflicts that could damage international relations. Guardsman Morrison remained at attention throughout the discussion, his eyes fixed on the horizon as his training demanded. But his earlier demonstration of authority had fundamentally changed General Volkov's perception of the Queen's Guards and British military culture. The general's aide seized the opportunity to remind his superior of their pressing obligations. "General, the Defense Ministry meeting begins in 10 minutes. Secretary Harrison is expecting us to finalize the alliance protocols." The reminder of the high-stakes diplomatic meeting forced Volkov to prioritize his mission over his wounded pride. The military alliance negotiations represented months of preparation and could determine his country's security relationships for decades to come. "Lieutenant Colonel," General Volkov addressed Ashworth with newfound respect, "I acknowledge that I misunderstood your protocols and acted inappropriately. This incident should not reflect on the important alliance discussions between our nations." The formal apology, witnessed by hundreds of tourists and recorded by numerous cameras, marked a complete reversal of the general's earlier arrogance. His military training finally overcame his personal pride as he recognized the strategic importance of damage control. Lieutenant Colonel Ashworth accepted the apology with professional dignity. "Misunderstandings between Allied forces are unfortunate but not uncommon, General. What matters is how we handle them and learn from the experience." The British commander's gracious response demonstrated the diplomatic skill that had made him suitable for his position at one of the world's most visible military posts. His handling of the situation would later be praised by his superiors as exemplary conflict resolution. As the immediate tension began to diffuse, General Volkov found himself studying the guards with new understanding. He noticed details he had previously overlooked, the subtle indicators of rank and service, the physical bearing that suggested genuine military training, and the quiet confidence that came from real combat experience. The crowd of tourists began to disperse as the confrontation wound down, many reviewing their photos and videos with excitement about witnessing such an unusual event. Several news organizations would later request copies of the footage for international broadcast. Captain Petrov guided his general toward their waiting diplomatic vehicle, relieved that the situation had been resolved without arrests or formal diplomatic protests. But he knew that the incident would follow them to their important meeting and potentially throughout the rest of their London visit. As they walked away from the palace gates, General Volkov experienced a profound shift in perspective. His entire understanding of military bearing and ceremonial duty had been challenged and changed by his confrontation with traditions he had not understood or respected. The diplomatic meeting that followed would prove successful, with alliance protocols signed and strategic partnerships established. But General Volkov's reputation had been permanently altered by those crucial minutes at Buckingham Palace, when his arrogance met an immovable force of British military tradition. Within hours, news of the incident had spread through military and diplomatic channels across Europe. The story became a cautionary tale about the importance of cultural understanding in international military cooperation and a reminder that true military authority comes from respect, not just rank. General Marcus Volkov returned to his homeland with successful treaty negotiations completed, but he carried with him a new appreciation for the diverse expressions of military excellence he had encountered in London. The silent guardsman who had never moved from his post had taught the visiting general more about leadership and discipline than any textbook ever could.